Hello there, my name is Gavin Walsh and today is Wednesday the 29th of October 2025. Welcome to the second part in the St. Kevin Files, The Truth Shall Out. And today I'd like to talk to you about the very early days in aviation in Ireland. For that we have to go back to the world's first human powered flight, which was by the Wright brothers in December 1903. Now, over the next 10 years, people started building aircraft everywhere once they knew how to do it and once they knew the mechanism of flight. But they were all amateurs. By 1914, 10 years later, the world's first air service was launched in Tampa. It was a very short service across a water inlet. But over the next number of years, small airlines started to develop that were carrying passengers. Now they were passengers, but they were very, very, very mediocre and very small. In 1919, Michael Collins, the finance minister of the Free State in Ireland, set up what was called an Air Council, allowing for the eventuality that Ireland may one day have its own airline. And 2 years later, at the treaty debates, they put that into part of the debate procedure that Ireland would have Ireland would have rights, and any Irish airline would have rights between England and Ireland. They were certainly ahead of their time, but it remained on the back burner for the next almost decade and a half. And in the mid-30s, a young solicitor in Dublin who had great skyward visions, he was a member of the Irish Aero Club. He himself, he came up with an idea of why shouldn't Ireland have its own national airline? That young solicitor was a man called Sean O'Hocka, obviously an Irish name, and he had a line of sorts to a senior civil servant in the Irish Department of Industry and Commerce, a man called John Gladon. Now, John Gladon was the secretary at that ministerialship, and that the minister itself, of course, was Sean Lemass, who subsequently became the Taoiseach of Ireland. Sean O'Hocka brought this idea of a national airline to John Gladon, and John Gladon in turn brought it to his boss, who was Sean Lemass. And over time, from ping-ponging and talking about it, Sean Lemass eventually brought it to the Dáil floor. And in 1935, it started to gain traction. And eventually, a limited company was agreed upon that would be set up called Aer Lingus Teoranta, which literally means limited. But prior to that, however, as the company was being formulated, the legal aspect of the company had to be set up, and the rules and regulations guiding such. And Ireland brought in an act called the Fatal Accidents Act, and this covered all forms of transportation, including the soon-to-be launched national airline, Aer Lingus. Ireland also signed up to the most recent international air regulatory body, which was the Warsaw Navigation Act of 1929, and that Navigation Act laid out all sorts of things from regulations and rules and what airlines could fly in and out of what countries. It gave what are called rights of passage, but it also laid down the rules of litigation and should anybody be killed or injured in a crash, and right down to even if your suitcase was lost. And those laws were formulated. So Ireland became a signatory of both that and their own fatal accidents piece of legislation that was put in place immediately prior to Aer Lingus being formed. And Aer Lingus was, of course, formed in May 1936, and its first flight was to Bristol. And it was a single aircraft airline, carried, I believe, anything from 6 to 8 passengers. And it flew over and back to Bristol, and eventually it expanded. This is all pre-war, by the way, before World War II. And eventually it expanded to Croydon, which was the main airport in London. Heathrow was not even on the cards at this point. And it also flew to Liverpool and Manchester. And over the next 2 or 3 years, they grew the fleet to 2 or 3 aircraft at most. And then, of course, the war hit. And during the war, Aer Lingus were strictly back to, they just went to Liverpool and perhaps Manchester, but London was off the cards, as was Bristol, for safety reasons, in case they'd run into German Luftwaffe. And even those flights to Liverpool, which was majority Liverpool, were haphazard, to say the least. And so it went on until the war ended. John Leyden brought it to the attention of the government that he had a relation, a Canadian-born man who had American citizenship, a 43-year-old man called Robert Archibald Logan, known as Bob now. Bob was a bit of an illustrious character. He had the unique distinction of being shot down by a squadron led by the German ace, the Red Baron. In fact, he was known as the Ace of Aces, Richthofen, Manfred von Richthofen. Thankfully, Logan survived this, and he survived being shot down and crash landed his plane somewhere. But after the war, he went on to become an operations manager with Pan American Airways, which was becoming a pretty big airline at the time, and they were traveling international routes. But Bob had this big job with them. But a relation of his, of course, was our man in Ireland here, John Leyden, and John Leyden persuaded him to throw the towel in on the big stuff and come to the small little fledgling airline in Ireland, which he did, and he became the general manager, what would today be known as the chief executive officer of the newly formed Aer Lingus. Now, Bob Logan took a shine to a young accountant, a 29-year-old accountant from Sandymount in Dublin, called Jeremiah Dempsey, or Jerry Dempsey, and he inbuilt into him the whole idea that safety was the way to go with the airline business, to be safety all the way, terribly safety conscious, as he had been instilled, and had been instilled in him in Pan Am. And his logic was very simple: if you have a crash, people won't fly, or certainly won't fly with you, especially if you get a bad record. And he was at the helm of Aer Lingus right into the early days of the war, and he instilled this safety ethos right into Jerry Dempsey. And of course, the war came along, and everything was down to slim margins with minimal flights, as I said earlier. But after the war, Jerry Dempsey then became the chief executive of, or the general manager of Aer Lingus. That term didn't exist back then. As soon as the war ended, Aer Lingus were set ready to hit the ground running in terms of getting back to business. Jeremiah Dempsey, or Jerry as he was known, Jerry Dempsey, was firmly at the helm at this point. And there were a surplus of two huge things in aviation after the war: aeroplanes, warplanes, and pilots. And at that time, there had been 16,079 to be precise, DC-3s built. And some of these were obviously built before the war as commercial, but they quickly became warplanes during the war, and they were turning them out at a phenomenal rate. But they were coming up on the market after the war. They believed they were costing anything from about £20,000 to £30,000 each in 1945 pounds. And Aer Lingus set about purchasing them. So they were getting these warplanes, and they were having them converted by a company in Scotland. And not just Aer Lingus were doing this; all the European and American airlines were doing it because the war was over. And also there was rumour of the jet age coming in, and these planes would effectively be redundant in military usage in a short time. But as well as this, there was the huge surplus of pilots. And Aer Lingus was hiring pilots from our own Air Corps, but they were also getting them fully qualified in the DC-3, which is what the St. Kevin was. They were getting them fully qualified coming out of the RAF and the DC-3. And they set upon hiring these pilots and purchasing these planes from the British military or whatever military would sell them. They also bought some from the American military. And in any event, something else happened the following year. On April the 5th, I believe, 1946, Britain and Ireland signed the Anglo-Irish Air Agreement. Now, this agreement was spectacular for the times we're in it. And basically, what it did for the Irish government, it freed the Irish government of the huge financial burden that it would take to expand Aer Lingus. So what was in it for the British government was the British government wanted their airline, or their airlines. There was 3 airlines that since became British Airways, but they wanted one of those airlines, British BOAC, which was British Overseas Aircraft Corporation. They wanted them to be able to fly the Atlantic, and you couldn't fly the Atlantic from London to Gander, but you could from Shannon to Gander. So What the British government negotiated was full rights to Shannon. Now, this was only problematic on the westbound sector. It wasn't on the eastbound sector because you had the jet streams that would give it an added advantage of about an hour in flight time. Aer Lingus at this point weren't even considering the Atlantic travel, so they were happy to trade this, to give this to the British government, or the Irish government were happy to trade it on behalf of Aer Lingus. And in turn, the Irish government, as per Michael Collins's 1990 Air Council, they were happy to invoke that, which gave the Irish national airline Aer Lingus full rights to travel between the Republic of Ireland and any British city. In other words, the British national airline, which was British BEA, British European Airways, they would not be permitted to have those same rights. So it basically gave Ireland a huge monopoly on the Irish Sea. In other words, to fly, I should say there was only Shannon and Dublin at that point, but any potential airports that were built would fall under this agreement. And of course, what was in it for Britain was that they could, their airline, BOAC, or the international segment of their airline, could then start launching daily flights to the United States. And how they would do that, obviously, was that if an 8-hour trip, these are propeller planes, remember, but they're big 4-engine propeller ones flying the Atlantic, and they'd have an 8-hour trip to Gander, which is right on the northeast tip of Newfoundland, Canada. They'd refuel there, and then they'd do another 7 or 8 hours down to New York, or 9 or 10 hours to Chicago. And coming back to this, they did the same thing, except for they didn't need Shannon. They'd need Gander, but not Shannon on the way back. Now, as part of these negotiations, the Irish government demanded, or the negotiators on behalf of Aer Lingus demanded, a huge investment from the British government, and that investment was brokered at the rate of 60 to 40%. So the Irish government owned 60% of Aer Lingus, and the British government, believe it or not, owned 40%. So it was effectively an Anglo-Irish airline tied into the Anglo-Irish Air Agreement. It also allowed for huge investment into Aer Lingus from the British government, in which they rapidly expanded. So by 1946, they went from two or three planes to 14, a full fleet of 14 planes, and 70 pilots, and about half that again in air stewardesses, as flight attendants were then known at that time. It can be said that Aer Lingus came out the better of this deal, but financially certainly the better. But another thing that should be noted is that there were initially there were 7 seats on the board of Aer Lingus, and the British government demanded 3 of them seats and successfully got them. And how they awarded those seats was the general manager, or CEO as it is today, of the British BEA, British European Airways. He automatically got a seat by default, as did the BOAC, which is the British Overseas Aircraft, or BOAC, British Overseas Aircraft Corporation. So their GM automatically got a seat. And then another one was picked by the British government. So what you had was, on the board of Aer Lingus in 1946, you had 7 members, 3 of whom were British and 4 were Irish. So you can see there was a huge close-knit tying of a business relationship there. And again, we will use this to bring to reality what unfolded in 1952.